In Nova Scotia's Gully Lake Wilderness area, there are lots of wonderful trails to explore at any time of year. They're particularly spectacular in the fall. The Sandy Cope Trail is one of those, and it's where I'm on my walkabout today. The primary access for most people to the Sandy Cope Trail is from a trailhead on the Kemptown Road. From here, I'm headed along the Yellow Birch Trail for about 850 meters or so before briefly joining up with the Earltown Lake and Portage Trail and then on to the Sandy Cope Loop. There is another option to reach the Sandy Cope Trail. If you head through the parking area at the Yellow Birch Trail trailhead and onto what is a combination of Fire Road and in the winter snowmobile Route 104, and travel for about 1.5 kilometers, you will reach another trailhead, this one directly on the Sandy Cope Trail. Well, this is the end of the Yellow Birch Trail, and it's here that I join the Earltown Lakes and Portage Trail. If I was to head back that way, I would end up at Highway 311, the Alex McDonald Road, and Sugar Moon Farm. Pancakes. That is very tempting. But I'm going to continue on to the Sandy Cope Trail. This area was the site of the Bragg lumber mill, run by Charles Bragg. One of his sons, John, would go on to form Oxford Frozen Foods. The mills produced 32,000 board feet of lumber a day, big mills by the standards of those times. The Cobequid Eco Trail Society is responsible for the trails in this wilderness area, and they've done a lot of work looking at maps from the 1600s and 1700s, which show routes previously taken by English, French, and Mikmaq. French maps showed travel along the nearby Salmon River and a portage route going to the Mi'kmaq village of Barachois. The Portage Trail is named in recognition of the portage routes as it connects the Oise River to the Salmon River that this bridge crosses. So this is where I joined the Sandy Cope Trail. Now this trail was named after a lake that's at about the midway point of this hike, and in turn that lake was actually named after a Mi'kmaq hunting guide who worked in this area and was born in 1853. Many sites along this trail are named for people with connections to this land. For example, I'm passing Widow Hatton's Ridge, which was named for Catherine Hatton, a young bride who would have received a land grant here of about 200 acres in 1818. So back to the name of this trail. Alexander, or Sandy Cope, led hunting trips out of Mount Tom and Debert. He almost certainly would have crossed through this area on those trips. According to his death record, he was born in Sheet Harbor and died in 1930. He was the son of Francis, or Frank, who was a Mi'kmaq Catholic, and Mary Ann, who was Irish Catholic. He was the oldest of their children. It's said Cope was a large man as an adult, perhaps as tall as 6'6" and 280 pounds, an imposing figure. There are stories found in the archives throughout the late 1800s about his size and strength. One story talks about him having been seen carrying a caribou near here, and based on the footprints, people say he never put it down other than to have a cup of tea. Cope weighed the caribou at 220 pounds. Caribou, incidentally, had once been numerous here, but were all but gone from the Cobequid Mountains by 1919. By 1882, archives say Cope was living in Shubenacadie, and he married Matilda Stevens of Knoll. 19 years later, they had 6 children recorded in the Truro census. Of course, these forests would have been important to the Mi'kmaq long before Cope began his work as a hunting guide here. The Mi'kmaq traveled these forests for generations, sometimes for seasonal movement, sometimes for hunting, and sometimes simply for visiting. Indigenous people relied on what the environment could provide. They understood how to listen to nature. For example, in early spring, fireflies emerge in the form of beetles. In this area, that happens in early May. Mikmaq knew that when those beetles are seen, the trees are waking up and pulling water from the ground. That signals the time to remove birch bark from the trees for making canoes and coverings for homes, because the bark would come off in very strong sheets, sometimes as much as a 1/4 inch thick. After a few weeks, fireflies take to the air and their tails light up the night sky in mating dances. The leaves on the birch tree by this point are fully formed, and water is being pulled between layers of bark. And peeling of the bark results in thinner sheets, which, while not much use for canoes or shelter, bark which can be used in things like lining of bowls or making cups. This is Sandy Cope Lake. Now, earlier I talked about the naming of this trail. Now, back in 2007, members of the Trails group here went in search of an, at that time, unnamed lake that appeared on topographical maps. 3 men, Garnet McLaughlin, Kyle Patriquin, and Norris Whiston, were flagging the trail for a connection to this lake. The story goes that Garnet and Kyle went down through the dense spruce forest, but Norris thought it might be easier to go along the shoreline of the lake. Turned out the shore route wasn't that easy. The grade of the land suddenly dropped off, and Norris ended up in the lake. As a result, it was planned to name the lake and the trail for the steep drop towards the water. But Mi'kmaq historian Don Awalt suggested that the trail and lake be named for Sandy Cope. Well, this is more or less the highest point on the Sandy Cope Loop. Since the trailhead, I've climbed about 140 meters, taking me to 240 meters above sea level. As the saying goes, it's all downhill from here. That's after the break. I'm on the Sandy Cope Trail in the Gully Lake Wilderness area. Now, one day, some of the trails in this area will form part of the Cape to Cape Wilderness Trail from Cape George to Cape Chignecto. And eventually that will become part of the International Appalachian Trail. The Cobequid Eco Trail Society, which is responsible for these trails, has built 25 kilometers worth in this wilderness area alone. The Gully Lake Wilderness Area protects a portion of the Cobequid Mountains, rising 300 meters above sea level. I'm working my way down now from the highest point on this hike, which sits at around 240 meters. Gully Lake covers an area of almost 4,000 hectares. The rivers here run mostly into Truro's Salmon River. There are a mix of deciduous and coniferous trees in this wilderness. Plants and animals which need large patches of unspoiled wilderness to survive thrive here among red maple, balsam fir, black cherry, and many other species. This area of sugar maple mixed with beech and birch was the site of one of the last land grants in this area in 1890. It went to Thomas McMullen, who was an MLA and a forester. In fact, by the standards of those days, he would have been considered a mega forester. With a history of forestry and homes, this area is crisscrossed with old logging and homestead roads, some of which can still be made out, and some not so much. The old McIntosh Lake Trail is a trail that you can make out and you can even use, as you can see. No one's quite sure when it was built, though it was expanded around 1959 by Bragg forestry workers and then in use until the 1990s. If you head that way, it will take you back to the snowmobile route, a shortcut off the Sandy Cope Trail. If you follow the road in the other direction to the northeast, you'll reach McIntosh Lake and the former homestead of George and Jessie McIntosh. Sadly, 2 of their girls are said to have drowned in that lake. Following the trail in that direction will also take you, after a very long hike, to Glen Road in Dalhousie Settlement. Some place names in this area do not come from the history, but rather come from what it looks like. The White Brook Forest is one such place. The Sandy Cope Trail crosses White Brook twice. The name is a mystery, going back to at least its appearance on topographical maps in 1902. Perhaps the name comes from the white rock in the area, or the frothing of the river waters making the water itself appear white. Well, this is called Donald's Falls, and it's named after 2 Donalds. There was Donald Mackenzie, who received a 250-acre land grant here in 1816, and Donald MacDonald, who received 400 acres in 1828. It's believed that Mackenzie likely had a sawmill right along this waterfall. It's long lost to the forest now, if it ever existed. There is a Mackenzie's Road in this area. It was one of the former homestead roads that runs through here. Of course, that road is named for the Donald Mackenzie, the Donald of the waterfall. His property included access to Salmon River, which is what would have given him the potential to power a mill. There were many Mackenzies with land grants throughout the Gully Lake Wilderness area, and it's possible many may have been related to Donald Mackenzie. For nearly 60 years, these forests were home not only to wildlife, but to the hermit of Gully Lake, Willard Kitchener MacDonald. He lived in these woods until his death at the age of 87 in 2004. He had lived here from the time he had jumped off a troop ship to avoid conscription in 1944. These days, there's a trail. It goes off to the east for about 2.5 kilometers, and it's named in his honor. The Halifax Herald called MacDonald the most isolated person in all of Atlantic Canada at the time of his death. Yet at the same time, he was a bit of a celebrity. Even the provincial website for the wilderness area mentions it as his former home. He was born in Massachusetts in 1916. And while the government of Canada offered an amnesty to World War II deserters in 1950, he remained afraid of retribution and stayed living in the woods. He made his living trapping and selling pelts. It was enough money for a monthly trip 12 kilometers into Earltown to buy supplies from the general store. MacDonald lived a hard life. A year before his death, the hut that he lived in this forest burned to the ground. He reluctantly accepted help from Colchester County, who built him a cabin. But when friends came to visit concerned about his health, he fled into the forest. There was a search by about 100 volunteers throughout this wilderness area, and a year later, his remains were found. There's a documentary you can watch about his life on YouTube. It's actually narrated by Randy Bachman of the Guess Who and the Bachman-Turner Overdrive. The land around this spot is fairly flat. It suggests it may have actually been a homestead or another building at one time. Of course, that's lost to the forest at this point. At this intersection, you find the other end of the McIntosh Road. I could go this way, continue along the Sandy Lake Trail for another few hundred meters, and it would take me back to the portage route that I came in on. But I'm headed out this way to snowmobile route 104, and I'm going to take that way back to the trailhead. This trailhead is on snowmobile route 104. To the east, it will take you all the way to Guysborough, across both dedicated and multi-use trails. I'm headed in the other direction, a route which not only goes back to the trailhead for the Yellow Birch Trail, but also on to Amherst. It's just over a kilometer from here, down this route to the way I came in. Over in the marsh, you can still find the remains of sawdust piles. Those piles are decades old. Most of the piles would have been created during the operations here between 1959 and 1962, and then later by the Bragg Mill. Some days, the water in the river is even clear enough that you can see the remains of the original bridge under the surface. The Sandy Cope Trail is one of many in this wilderness area that follow the path and the history of the Mi'kmaq, as well as those who followed in their footsteps, like generations of settlers and the hermit of Gully Lake. The Cobequid Eco Trail Society has done a lot of work in this area to ensure that their history and their stories are not forgotten. After the break, I'm headed not far from here to take a deeper and much older dive into the Mi'kmaq history of the Cobequid Mountains.
Feel the sunshine.
Imagine this landscape over 10,000 years ago as an ice age was coming to an end. Animals that would be unrecognizable today. The Mi'kmaq living at the base of the Cobequid Mountains in an environment teeming with wildlife living from the land. That's the story that this trail, the Mi'kmaq-Debert Interpretive Trail, tells, and it's where I'm on my walkabout today. These days, Debert is a farming area outside of Truro that's home to an airport that once served as an Air Force base. Crews received training here prior to deployment to Europe during the Second World War. However, more than 11,000 years ago, people lived here on a vast plain that stretched south from the Cobequid Mountains. This trail network was built on this land by the Mi'kmaq to share their history. Walking the 4.5-kilometer trail, you'll travel across land that has been walked for many generations of Mi'kmaq and passes through forest and landscape which has adapted as the climate has changed over thousands of years. Debert is the site of important archaeological investigations. In fact, the Debert archaeological sites are among the most important archaeological sites for Indigenous people in all of North America. And for the past decade, the Mi'kmaq have played a key role in preserving this ancestral location. Over 4,500 artifacts from excavations here are now housed in the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Hull, Quebec. Archaeologists consider the time between about 13,500 and 11,000 years ago as the oldest period of human settlement across North and South America. The environment was rapidly changing. The last of the Ice Age glaciers had disappeared from this area, leaving behind valleys, lakes, and rivers. But it was still cold. The land was covered in small spruce, birch, and alder forests, clustered in protected areas. To imagine how different this landscape was, just consider this. The Minas Basin, which is beyond Cape Split at the end of the Bay of Fundy, and is now a powerful tidal testing area, would have been a dry grassland. Despite that, the Mi'kmaq still would have had access to resources from the ocean, things like fish and sea mammals. As well, there would have been bison and elk, giant short-faced bears, and giant beavers. It would have been an environment that's very different from today, although at the same time, it would have been remarkably similar to much of the environment during the history of Mi'kmaq. It's impossible to know exactly what life would have been like here 10,000 years ago, or even 5,000 years ago. But archaeologists have worked hard looking at the results of their investigations combined with generations of oral histories to better develop an understanding of life here. This site is unique for many reasons. This is really the only place where so many artifacts have been found in one location, in addition to permanent structures like stone hearths that would have been used for cooking and keeping warm. Now, the Mi'kmaq were a people that traveled seasonally. They would go to the coast in the summer and they would come inland in the winter, making the fact there were permanent structures here that much more special. It is all but certain that this area would have been used seasonally, though perhaps a small number of people stayed on all year. That a semi-permanent community would have been built is not a surprise. The Mi'kmaq used well-established routes for travel, settling in on the same area from season to season. Mi'kmaq not only traveled seasonally, but also for many reasons that we travel today, like visiting relatives and friends. It's possible as well that some community members traveled very long distances, including outside the Maritimes. One can imagine how long a journey that would have been thousands of years ago. Long-distance travel would have been the only way to spread news. You know, storytelling was done in many different ways, and often it was not just about sharing news, but it was about entertainment as well. Stories would often be accompanied by a noisemaker like a drum or a hollowed-out log, and the stories could take days to tell, often accompanied by feasts and dancing. It would really be a celebration. Now, the storytellers themselves were almost like the news anchor. They were really important in the community. This was the way that information got shared. And the skill of storytelling was passed down through the generations, just like the stories themselves. The more investigations done here to learn about the history of this place, the more is found. There are now more than 10 archaeological sites here in Divert. An interpretive center is planned for the site, with the location having been chosen and plans well underway. Plans which include additional trails to allow visitors to walk in the footsteps of the Mi'kmaq from long ago. The Elders Advisory Council here has a concept to describe this place. We grew up from the earth. Here and on the Sandy Cope Trail, the Indigenous history is self-evident. But there's nowhere that I hike where Indigenous peoples have not gone before, and the land with its history has so many stories to tell. Wherever your next walkabout finds you, be sure to take a moment and listen to those stories.
Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Hey, come on, feel the sunshine. Oh, come on, won't you be mine? Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine. Oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, feel the sunshine.